I'm Alice Loxton and I present documentaries over on History Hit TV. If you're passionate about all things history, sign up to History Hit TV. It's like Netflix, but just for history. We've got hours of ad-free documentaries about all aspects of the past. You can get a huge discount from History Hit TV. Make sure you check out the details below and use the code ABSOLUTEHISTORY, all one word, when you sign up. Now, on with the show.
Each California Channel Island has its own heartbeat. Each island has its own dynamic, its own size, its own orientation, its own very intimate personal history.
Well, this is the final frontier of our continent, at any rate.
There's 8 islands off the coast of California. The 4 northerly ones are kind of in a line just off of Santa Barbara here.
The southern 4 islands are more widely scattered, but to just say that they're a group of islands is to completely misrepresent what they are. They are the trace of a vanished world.
I do this interview with a little hesitation, and I'm a little nervous about what we're doing here. If you love this island, for God's sakes, don't come here.
Some days the islands look as though you can touch them. They're so close, but unpredictable weather out here can change that, and it has caused many people to lose their vessels, lose their lives in some cases.
The oceans around the islands are unlike the mainland ocean. They're remote, they're hard to access.
I kind of think of our California Channel Islands as our North American equivalent of the Galapagos.
I coined this phrase and I say it today. Hi, this is Channel Islands National Park. This is the greatest national park in America, and that's what it is.
I've been living here for 22 years, within sight of the islands. Although I've written many books in this house, I often wondered what goes on out there.
What does it all mean? It's the history of our species, you know. We're studying human behavior at different time periods and the different challenges that human beings faced in the past.
When people look across the horizon and see the Channel Islands, they are nothing other than a silhouette out on the ocean. But once one has stepped on just one island, you can never look at the island with the same eyes again.
I would love to be able to tell a story fully in my language, but unfortunately, my great-grandfather told my father, "Why do you need to learn the language? There's nobody left. Who are you going to talk to?" So I start with Sahipaka, once upon a time.
Most days, the Channel Islands sit in plain view of millions of people along the California coast. Hardly anyone can tell you their names, let alone what the natives called them long before. Archaeologists know that these islands have been inhabited for thousands and thousands of years, perhaps longer than any place in North America. With a human history like that, there are stories to tell, stories of who was there first and how they got there, stories of those who came later looking for adventure or gold, or just to get far away, of one that got left behind, and some just trying to get back home.
When I tell people that Santa Barbara and the Channel Islands used to be down by San Diego, they just think I'm crazy. They say, "What?" So we're looking here at the 4 northern Channel Islands. There's San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa. So these 4 islands are all in a line, and they're lined up with the coast over there. That's the Santa Monica Mountains. That's all one big east-west line of peaks. These transverse ranges are unique. They're the only ones in the whole coast of North America. They didn't start that way. They used to be parallel to the coast like all the other mountain ranges, but there's a very good reason for them. Namely, that they used to be down by San Diego, and they were completely turned around, 110 degrees. Well, there was this idea of continental drift in the world for a long time, but we just didn't know how it worked. But when I started graduate school, they figured it out, that all the continents are really embedded in these big old plates that are going across the face of the Earth. Just by looking at the history of the formation of the Pacific Plate, we could see when it began to rub against North America and pull off the pieces, set up the San Andreas. That's what I worked out. With just the right tools, I love geometry. I'm horrible at lots of things, but I love geometric relationships, and that's just what plate tectonics was. This is how it looked 18 million years ago. The islands here were right off of San Diego. So then coming forward in time, there's 18, 12, 6 million years to the present. So now the islands are way up here and San Diego's way down there. Just got pulled away and turned around. I just love these islands because they're so unique, besides being beautiful.
Channel Islands are amazing for the discoveries, archaeological, historical, ecological, biological, that they've produced over the last 150 years of scientific investigation.
One of the wonderful things about the Channel Islands is that there are no burrowing animals. There's no gophers, there's no ground squirrels, there are no earthworms, there's no termites, nothing that's churning those deposits. And so for an archaeologist and a geologist, it's just a wonderful record because it's just like a layer cake. You can look at the different strata and really get a refined, precise look at changes that have occurred through time. Our curator of anthropology here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History was Phil Orr. One of the interesting research questions he was pursuing was the story of the pygmy mammoth.
It's clear, say 20,000 years ago, the Ice Age was still full swing. We had mammoths all over the larger island of Santa Rosa, which included Anacapa, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel. Where did pygmy mammoths come from? Looking at mammoth behavior, we use as a model modern elephants. And there are documented cases of elephants swimming over 20 miles.
It's believed that this particular animal evolved originally from the Columbian mammoth, represented here, that originally colonized the northern Channel Islands, to what they evolved to ultimately on the Channel Islands as the pygmy mammoth. And that species disappeared right around the time window when Native Americans show up on the islands.
Phil Orr first came out here in 1941, and so he probably began building this camp somewhere right around late 1940s. His purpose, I think, in making his camp on this part of the island was because it's such a hot spot for all the things he was interested in. The pygmy mammoth bones, there's lots of great archaeology here covering all periods of prehistory.
I would characterize him as the last of the bone hunters.
I think he's a fascinating character because he did so many good things, and he did some things that are really off the wall and wild and crazy.
Well, Phil Orr used some techniques by today's standards that would be not approved, I think.
He was interested in whether humans and pygmy mammoths were together on the islands at the same time, and that led him to look very deep in the deposits, much deeper than we usually find archaeological sites.
Well, as I understand it, this wasn't publicized greatly. Orr loved to drive his Jeep, and what he was doing was putting a road across Arlington Canyon. They were down here trying to get to the other side of the canyon. They got mired down, and they were extricating the Jeep, and they looked up and saw this femur sticking out of the cliffside.
And carefully scraped around it and exposed the whole profile to show that in fact it was intact in an ancient arroyo that had later filled in.
He found 2 human femurs protruding from the sidewall of Arlington Canyon 37 feet below the existing ground surface.
He knew at that point enough about the geological relationships in these deep alluvial beds on Santa Rosa to know that he was way back in time.
And so he got a grant to bring some of the leading scientists of his day, the leading archaeologists, and they came out here, and they were very critical. You know, they they weren't necessarily going to buy into this, but they all agreed that the Arlington bone was buried in an original sediment layer. It wasn't the result of recent erosion. Phil could not date the actual bones themselves because in those days, radiocarbon dating would have consumed all of the bones, and there were problems with bone protein dating. And he collected some charcoal nearby the bones, which he radiocarbon dated to about 10,000 years ago. And so what Phil Orr did was the smart thing. He wrapped the original soil matrix containing the bones, wrapped it in a plaster jacket, and removed it here to the mainland.
I had read Phil Orr's Prehistory of Santa Rosa Island. That was the go-to book resource to look at. I read that, came here and saw what was on the island and said, Orr didn't get it all. There's an awful lot of material here that looks unstudied, and was informed by the ranch foreman. I was the first archaeologist to set foot on these islands in 17 years. I realized that I had struck gold. The ranch foreman showed me a burial. He's turned out to be at the oldest positively dated burial in California. So I thought, okay, if this burial at Lobos Canyon is old, what about Arlington Man?
1987, I was just newly hired at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And this archaeologist from Channel Islands National Park, who I'd met once or twice, he came to me and he says, John, I understand you have a block of earth stored there at the museum that has the bones of Arlington Springs Man that Phil Orr excavated back in 1960. And I said, well, I'd seen something in the basement covered with plaster that had the name Arlington Springs written on it, but I didn't know anything about it.
And you led me down into the sub basement, the catacombs.
As I recall, you had to brush the tarantulas off my back.
And we find this flock, and bingo, it's Christmas time.
So we opened up that plaster jacket, and there were the bones exactly as Phil Orr had removed them. We located an expert in radiocarbon dating ancient bone, and that was Dr. Thomas Stafford. I sent him the sample, and a little while later, Tom called me, and he says, you know, I'm going to be in California. Can I come up and see you? And so we sat in the office, and Tom sat down with us, and he said, you have the oldest dated human skeletal remains in North America. And our jaws kind of dropped. Lo and behold, these bones were at least 13,000 years old.
And that's really significant because that's the same age as Clovis. And Clovis is basically, or was thought for a long time, to be the first American culture.
So we went ahead and did a paper based on that and presented it at the California Island Symposium. And then it got national attention.
But it's kind of odd to have a Clovis-age skeleton on the Channel Islands when most people at that time didn't think that seafaring or island colonization or coastal adaptations existed in the New World until much later. At the time, the idea was that there was an ice-free corridor in the center of North America that led people down this sort of funnel-shaped tunnel from Alaska into the center of North America, and that people only gradually spread to the coast over the ensuing millennia.
And it just opens up all sorts of alternative possibilities and understanding of how the entire continent was colonized.
It was an ecologist who came up with the idea of the kelp highway. All the way from Japan to Baja California, there are kelp forest ecosystems that have very similar suites of animals. They have the same shellfish, the same fish, sea otters.
This connects with the whole idea of a coastal migration, an ancient coastal migration, when people would have been using watercraft and going around glaciers when they encountered them and working their way down until they came to California.
People showed up on this island 13,000 years ago or thereabouts and evolved through time into the group we know as the Chumash.
What does it all mean? It's the history of our species, you know. We're studying human behavior at different time periods and the different challenges that human beings faced in the past, different environmental conditions, how they responded to those conditions, how they changed their culture through time. It just gives us a greater understanding of our own human behavior, of our own species, you know, by studying what occurred in the ancient past.
I get the feeling that we've just barely begun to scratch the surface. We're just digging in, beginning to learn what to look for. I personally feel the next frontier lies offshore in the parts of this island that have been submerged. So there's a lot out here, and I think we're just getting started.
Now they're lifting their metal hands. People in the streets see it now. They're running toward the East River, thousands of them, dropping in like rats. This is the end now.
If you recall that Orson Welles radio show with War of the Worlds, where they broadcast that and everybody just went crazy, people committed suicide, people volunteered for the military because they actually thought that aliens had landed. So imagine a society where these beings, with this bizarre technology, suddenly appear in a landscape where people have lived for thousands of years. I can't imagine anything more traumatic.
The Indians had never seen ships like ours or men like us. They fled in terror, leaving behind only empty huts and worn fires.
My people were the first ones to see the spaceship on the horizon, so to speak.
The first contact that indigenous peoples in Alta California had with Europeans comes in 1542 with the Voyage of Cabrillo.
Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was an adventurer and explorer. He was a soldier.
He worked for Spain all his life. It was a Spanish expedition that he led, and he had been participating in Spanish conquests and expeditions for some time.
Spanish had come into Mexico in the early 1500s, had gone through the process of conquest there, and were finally ready to set their sails and their sights on something further afield. And so Cabrillo came and stopped on the Channel Islands.
This was the furthest projection of Europe into a world that they knew nothing about. What he was trying to do, as what Columbus had been trying to do half a century earlier, is figure out a way to connect Europe to China. Now, Columbus didn't realize the Americas were in the way. The Spanish, by Cabrillo's time, obviously did. Once they found out it was full of silver and gold, though, that inconvenience suddenly lost some of its meaning.
We always say it's the 3 G's that brought people here: gold, God, and glory.
We're here at Spanish Landing on the shore of San Diego Bay, where the Maritime Museum of San Diego is building a reconstruction of Cabrillo San Salvador.
One of the purposes in the construction of this vessel was to help historians on the East Coast recognize that there was in fact history west of the Allegheny. Cabrillo landed in San Diego in 1542. That's well before Jamestown, well before Plymouth Rock.
It wasn't until 78 years later in the Mayflower expedition that settlers came into America. So historically, this is actually where America began.
So the idea was to reconstruct that thing to house the story, if you will. And people have been imagining what the San Salvador must have looked like for a long time. Mainly, though, she's going to embody the sense of who we are, our origin story, as it began with a confrontation with the unknown. The San Salvador was built in 1539. That was the beginning of what historians call the Gunpowder Revolution. The ship, armed with even the very primitive weapons she had, represented an enormous concentration of power at the time, as much as an aircraft carrier would in our world today.
Cabrillo built the original San Salvador with the aid of indigenous peoples that were conscripted into the project and soldiers, many of who had no experience in building ships.
They had a sign-up sheet for anybody interested in building a boat. You don't have to be a carpenter, you have to know anything, you just want to volunteer.
About 10 years ago, we began to research what the ship actually would have looked like, and it was quite a mystery for a number of reasons. For one, the ship had a short career. After the voyage to California, she went on another voyage to Peru and disappeared with all hands. There are no plans because ships were not built to plans in the middle of the 16th century. So we had to do a lot of forensic research into what this ship would have looked like.
I asked him how long it was going to take to build it, and he told me a year to a year and a half. It's hard to keep a straight face. That was 3.5 years ago. We're not done yet.
As Cabrillo sailed up the coastline, it was unknown how far the land tended to the north, how far it tended to the west. On some charts or maps of the period, it looks as though you get about to Santa Barbara and you're there, you're in China. His little fleet made remarkable progress given the fact that they didn't know where they were going. that they were sailing against wind and current, that they were trying to survey and chart the whole route all the way up the coast. And again, they were doing it with 16th century technology.
The sailors were pretty brave guys, they had to be, because these things don't handle very well. It's like an aspect ratio of a watermelon, and it's going to handle like one as well.
You don't get too far north of San Diego before you start to see these Channel Islands.
4 days later, we sighted 2 islands and named them after our ships. Sailing close, we saw many Indians from the bluffs calling to us to come ashore.
Not only do the Channel Islands have people on them, they're one of the longest inhabited places on the face of the earth.
They were well-skilled maritime people that were getting noted back when the first European contact came into the area.
When we saw these great ships, my ancestor, as the chief of the village, rallied her people together to say, hey, we have visitors. Let's welcome them and show them who we are.
It's not a normal thing for people previously unknown to one another to have perfectly amenable relations. And that's not very typical of Spanish behavior in this period at all. But by the standards of the day, this was a pretty benign expedition in terms of relations with the natives.
Cabrillo stayed for a little while on the channel, and then he tried to go further north.
It's against the wind and it's against the current the whole way.
And you can't even sail this thing to weather. All you can do is go downwind. Whatever the wind's blowing is where you're going.
And he basically got driven back, and then he wintered, we think, on San Miguel Island.
But wait! After all these years, Cabrillo's back. Well, not really. But except for the outboard motor, everything looks pretty authentic, doesn't it?
I, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, native of Portugal, do hereby claim all this land, which I call San Miguel.
We started building the vessel with relatively modern methods.
People walk by all the time going, hey, isn't that cheating? You're using electricity. We always say, well, you know what? If they had electricity and didn't use it, they'd be pretty foolish too.
We located virtually every piece of white oak in the country that met the standard.
Well, they all broke. Almost every rib that came back down on the truck had exploded.
So after purchasing all the material available in the country, we ruined half of it.
Overall, from the very tip of the stern to the end of the bowsprit is about 115 or 20 feet. And there were approximately 100 people on this boat with horses, cows, chickens, pigs, you name it. Sanitation was probably not one of their strong suits.
There were a number of diseases that seafaring life made you subject to. The most fearsome of all was probably scurvy. Your hair falls out, your skin loses its elasticity. Every injury you ever had comes back. So these guys, particularly Cabrillo, had lived violent lives as conquistadors. And when you start to get scurvy and it goes beyond a certain point, it's pretty horrific. All it would have taken would be stepping the wrong way if you'd had a broken bone previously and it would snap.
As I went ashore, my foot slipped on a rock and I fell on my right arm.
Most people think that the contacts had relatively little effect on the Shumash, but towards the end, I think there was some stress and some strain, and there was a conflict at Kyler Harbor, and I think that's when Cabrillo fell and got gangrene. The Spaniards probably stayed a little too long and pulled off some stunts that the Shumash weren't real happy with.
In early January, Cabrillo became ill. His right arm was swollen and green, and his voice was delirious.
His life had been placed at risk many, many times. He had lived a life of enormous adventure, but also great violence. It was just the last risk in a life of a lot of risk-taking, and he finally found a gamble he lost. Cabrillo sailed into San Diego Bay on September 28, 1542. By the very beginning of 1543, he was dead.
It seems most logical that he might have been buried on San Miguel, but you know, it takes a while for gangrene to actually kill somebody, so they were cruising the Channel Islands, and that's one of the mysteries that remains out there. It'd be something to find Cabrillo's grave.
We all understand that the first meetings throughout this country between your ancestors and mine was a tragic one. But those are times that have gone by. And with this century is a new time. This is a new time for partnerships. It's a new time to integrate and to learn from one another.
The San Salvador has been very shy about getting into the water. We think today we have coaxed the San Salvador into getting its feet wet.
Very proud as a San Diegan too, and we're going to have it in our bay apparently for history.
It's overwhelming to see the 19,000 hours of volunteer time that has been devoted, and you see it captured in one moment.
I want to swashbuckle across the deck, and it would fulfill a lifelong dream.
We're trying to say who we are by saying where we came from. That's a primordial thing, and I confess I wasn't sure it would work when we started, but we're standing on evidence that that does mean something to some people.
If you have a story to tell, what's the best way to represent it? And frequently it is with an artifact or an object, something people can touch, they can smell. Children spending overnight on this vessel smell the salt, they feel the ocean move.
We learn about our California history usually in 5th grade, and Cabrillo was one of the names, and then we promptly forgot it, and then we see it on all of the streets and schools and avenues around the state, and now it's going to put something behind that name.
If there was a written tradition to leave that survived, that would be extremely interesting, because we would have the other side of what first contact looked like. What we do have, though, is the petroglyph that we've identified and documented out in the Jacumba National Wilderness, which is one of the most rare works of art in all of the human inventory of art, and that is an authentic representation of first contact. Then that predates every known image of a recorded event in American history. It really does say America began here.
My father loved fishing, and as a young girl I used to look out and I would see this land. I always wondered what is out there. Little did I know that our families originated from those islands. We always knew we were Chumash. We always knew that through our name, Chumamayat. But we didn't know anything about our culture. We weren't meant to remember it. It was looked and frowned upon, and even punishment was happening to our families if they spoke the language or did ceremonies. So I start with Sahipaka, once upon a time.
When I'm out at a site, I can't help but imagine what it was like when people were living there. And the site I've been working at just really grabbed me. I went out there my first year of graduate school and fell in love with this site.
For Chumash Indians, their cultural heritage is here on the Channel Islands. So it's very important for them to understand their ancestral past.
I've been out here for 5 seasons now. And the reason I've decided to devote that much time to this site is we really don't have any information on a site like this. And I think it's a key to understanding the Chumash and the past in the Santa Barbara Channel area.
And it was only till around the 70s and 80s that being Chumash and being native in California was starting to mean things to people, and they really wanted to know about our culture. But we had a lot of education to learn ourselves.
I am Barbara Chumash, descendant of the last chief in Santa Barbara. I love the science and learning about how my people lived with their environment. So as we dig, we learn more. I went to school for it, and I'm an archaeologist.
This is the largest mound that still exists in the entire Santa Barbara Channel area. It also has more house depressions than any other archaeological site on the islands. So I'm trying to figure out, why is this site so different than the other ones? How many people were living here at the same time? And was this some kind of ceremonial center? We're slowly figuring things out, and every year we have another piece of the puzzle.
If we try to imagine what Chumash and other coastal Indian societies were like on the eve of Spanish colonization, would be to say that they had communities that were on the one hand thriving, but on the other hand were very vulnerable.
We know that the Chumash were primarily hunters and gatherers, and the Chumash out on the islands relied a lot on the foods from the sea, including fish, shellfish, and sea mammals.
We grew up eating a lot of the native foods. My brothers hunted and fished, learning from my father, who learned from his father, who learned from his father.
As rich and abundant as that marine environment was on the Channel Islands, there were still things they didn't have out there.
It is said that the word Mek-Chumash means island people, makers of shell bead money, for they would purchase large game on the mainland, the deer, bear.
And the mainland people would bring for trade hides and bones for making tools and other seeds that they don't have here, berries or plants, medicine also.
First discovery I made when I went out on Santa Cruz Island that was really exciting to me was the discovery of a village where they made blades that were used to make drills to drill beads.
So here we have the fractured pieces of the purple olive shell.
I don't know of any group in the world that had as many different types of beads at the same time as the Chumash did.
Here we have the finished shell bead money.
The neighbors of the Chumash compared them to the Chinese, who at that time, and probably still, are very sophisticated in economics.
These were complex societies. They had formal political structures.
The Chumash were just experts at adapting. I think they're highly resilient.
When we look at the density of people living on the Channel Islands and compare that to the rest of Aboriginal California, there were more people living per square mile on the Channel Islands than anywhere else.
So the Portola expedition in the late 1760s led to this chain of missions along the Camino Real that formed the mission system of Alta California.
It wasn't until the push northward from Baja California to establish the first missions in Alta California that the islanders really began to interact with Spanish on a fairly regular basis.
They brought with them pathogens, plants, and animals. Those three things began to make enormous differences in the realities of life for Chumash Indians, both here on the mainland and on the Channel Islands. The problem for the Indian communities was that these livestock began to trample their fields and their foodstuffs and their villages. And so you had basically three strikes working against these Indian populations to the point where they were experiencing a subsistence crisis, a food crisis.
So as the people started dying in these epidemics that came through here, wiping us out by the hundreds, that they needed more workforce. So then they started going out into the islands and bringing people back to the mainland.
As that population begins to decline, they lose leaders, they lose some of the elders of the community. And so you begin to have a kind of economic and even sort of metaphysical crisis going on within these communities.
The mainland Indians, by 1803, 1804, are pretty much all resettled at the missions.
At the height, we had almost 1,800 Chumash living here at the mission.
The old trading partners that the island Indians used to have are now at the missions. So what happens? In 1815, the most severe El Nino event in recorded history, during an El Nino, the kelp beds die back and the fish go elsewhere. And there are famine conditions on the Channel Islands.
The missions were producing food, and the Indians knew that.
All of a sudden, we see this migration of the last people living on the islands coming to the missions.
They didn't want us to continue harvesting from the ocean, changing of lifestyles, becoming more sedentary, gatherers, learning how to farm with domestic animals during that transition to the missionary period, which was more of a prison system.
I guess the only good part about the mission period was the baptism records. When they brought the people off the islands, they would document the people with their native names, the villages where they came from. When my great-grandfather was born in 1811, he was given that Spanish name Juan de Jesus, but then later as an adult, he was asked if he wanted that last name Tumamayat to be changed to Marquez. Oh, we'll give you this is your proper last name. He said, no, I don't think so. I'm gonna keep Tumamayat.
The Indians moving to the missions for their physical salvation paradoxically proved to result in just the opposite. As they gathered in larger numbers at these missions, they had that much more exposure to European diseases. And so it turned into nothing less than a killing field for them.
Well, I do think the period of initial European colonization and contact was devastating to the Chumash. It did cause the abandonment of the islands and probably a loss of a lot of knowledge.
It was forgotten for some time, but fortunately for us, the anthropologists remembered to talk to people who still had knowledge, and so it was written down.
John P. Harrington was an extraordinary ethnographer and anthropologist, and he took notes and interviewed tribal members up and down the Pacific coast.
Our culture comes from an oral tradition, no writings, and I really am grateful for that opportunity to be able to go back and read what their stories were. After my father passed, I was recipient of a ceremonial pipe. And in essence, that was the way of telling my family that it was my time to step up. I love talking with children. That was some of the programs my father did that I carried on after his passing. My grandfather's family were from Santa Cruz Island, and my grandmother's family was from Santa Rosa Island. I always wanted to go out there. And as we got closer to the cliffs of the island, I could see this glimmering along for miles, stretching across the walls of the cliffs. Well, it was the abalone and the shell. When I stepped onto the island on the land, it was just so amazing.
I think this was a persistent place, a very important place on the landscape. You can see all of Santa Rosa Island on a clear day. You can see San Miguel Island. And they came here, they had big red abalone feasts, and over time they kept visiting and the mounds started building up.
There is mixed feelings among the Chumash people. A lot of them don't believe in the archaeology or the study and why are you digging up the past. For me, we just learn from it and we can share things that we've learned through our grandparents that have told us, and we find it in the ground.
This is an ashy layer, and what I think it's burned roof fall.
What we've learned from some of the relatives back in those times of talking with Harrington, that when a person died in the houses were burnt. And all the belongings and everything that the person owned. To feel that ancestry and that long period of history is very, very exciting to our family. So to see some of the artifacts that were still on the ground that a relative of mine may have made that item was really beautiful to me.
Can't help but imagine what it would have been like, and so that's what I'm trying to reconstruct the best I can.
We're humans, and there's something natural about wanting to understand where we came from, how we got here, and even where we're heading.
When we walk on this land here on the island, we all have this sense of just really being home.
There's 8 islands off the coast of California. San Nicolas is the one that's the furthest out to sea. It's 60 miles from the nearest point on the mainland. If you read all the old historical accounts, they always complain either about the wind or the fog. You never see anybody talking about how wonderful the weather is. For the previous 25 years, I worked for the U.S. Navy on San Nicolas Island as the archaeologist. When I first started working there, I really didn't know much about the lone woman story at all, to tell you the truth. But I started reading about it, and people would ask me questions that I couldn't answer. So I did some more reading and quickly found out that there's so many conflicting versions of the story that nobody really knew the truth. So I kind of started down this path of trying to unravel what the real true story is.
The thought of being alone on the island while so many suns rose from the sea and went slowly back into the sea filled my heart with loneliness. I had not felt so lonely before because I was sure the ship would return. Now my hopes were dead. Now I was really alone.
The lone woman has been known by a number of names. Of course, we tragically don't know her real name, the name which she was called by her parents. She's often been termed the lone woman, or alternatively, the lost woman. She's also been known as Juana Maria, This was the name given to her by the Spanish padres upon her conditional baptism. And then, of course, Scott O'Dell chooses a third name, Corona.
The story of the lone woman is a fascinating story, and Scott O'Dell wrote this novel that today is required reading for most every fourth grader in the country.
So, kids, we're going to start reading this book today. It's called Island of the Blue Dolphins.
When I was a child and reading Island of the Blue Dolphin, I knew I was Gabrielle O'Keefe of descent, but I was not able to put that together, that her story was related to my tribe.
Scott O'Dell first wrote the narrative, and he had some good friends look at it and said, it's very good, and you've written a children's story. Now, this was a surprise to Scott. He had only ever written for adults.
And it's the story of this girl who ends up being left alone on the island when she's not much older than you.
Well, one thing we can say is that Scott O'Dell did a pretty good job of not only setting the landscape, but also of capturing what it would be like for a person to live alone on that island. Even though apparently he had never stepped foot on the island.
This upper window was the spot where Scott O'Dell's desk sat. So as you can see from this environment, he's far from the ocean. But in his head, he was right there with Corona on San Nicolas Island.
I didn't start with Scott O'Dell's version. I started with some of the actual accounts from that time period first. I can see most of where Scott O'Dell's story comes from. He just didn't have all the knowledge we have today.
My own research that sort of gets us to the story of who Juana Maria was and who her people were is our work at SNI 25, which is a village site that we've called the Tule Creek site. If you read Island of the Blue Dolphins, the very beginning describes Corral Harbor. This is the village described by Scott O'Dell. What he didn't know is he was right.
It's a huge story. It's a big story. It's not just about this one woman, but she's sort of the focal point. She was out there on San Nicolas Island. The Nicoleño were the brunt of two huge waves of explorers and entrepreneurs. The Spanish were coming up from the south and wanted to colonize California.
And it also marks the period when the Russian fur traders contracted with Kodiak Island sea otter hunters to come to the Channel Islands and use their kayaks, use their hunting technology to go after sea otters for the pelts for trade back to the old world.
I do not know what happened first, whether it was my father who raised his fist against the hunter whose path he barred.
Whether it was this man who stepped forward with a bale of pelts on his back and shoved my father aside. It all happened so quickly that I could not tell one act from the other.
The lone woman was on the island when the massacre occurred. This was something that we discovered details of in our search through Russian documents. There was a murder of one of those Alaska Native hunters by the Nicoleño. And in response, the Alaska Native hunters really went wild and nearly exterminated all the males on the island.
Which results in the population of the island getting smaller and smaller and smaller down to where there's hardly anybody left.
So in 1835, a boat named the Peoras Nada, which is often translated as better than nothing, set sail for San Nicolas Island to collect the remaining islanders and bring them to San Pedro.
Right now we have documentary evidence for 8 people who came off of the island.
When they got on that ship, I'm sure they had no idea what was in store for them. And if they could foresee that, there's no way they would have gone.
She is left behind. We know that. That's a fact. We know she's left behind. Why the exact circumstances of her being left behind are open to a lot of debate.
Part of the story is that she went back to retrieve her child.
I think in reading the various accounts, she just did not want to go with the group when they left.
She hid, and she wanted to make sure she was going to be safe. She didn't want to go anywhere where there's going to be more conflict.
What would you choose as an author? You know, your job is to tell the best story. So in his rendition, Corana's on board the ship. It's a little brother as opposed to a young child. So at the last minute, the ship will not turn back because of a brewing storm. She takes a dramatic leap overboard, swims back to rescue her brother.
Her life on the island, I think it is one of the real misconceptions that people have. Everybody always asks me, how does she survive? How does she get food? How does she do this? How does she do that? She's abandoned in her own town.
Around 1800, something like 200 or 300 people were living on that island. So there was enough food.
Yeah, everything's here. You don't need to worry about that kind of stuff. What you need to worry about psychologically, how do you deal with being alone now?
The Island of the Blue Dolphins is a book that I loved as a child, and going out to St. Nicolas Island and being able to see the landscape, smell it, feel the wind on my face, knowing the aloneness, the solitude that she would have felt was extraordinarily intense.
Now, I lived on this island my first 2 years at the park alone, so I can relate a little bit. I can imagine that over time she just got accustomed to how to enjoy herself and provide for herself.
I could really get a sense of what she must have gone through, although I could never possibly know. In a way, making that childhood dream come true just by being able to somewhat relive and then have such close physical contact with all of the archaeology that would have been very prevalent for her in her daily life.
I'm sure after a number of years of being alone, you're going to realize that that's it, you're alone. They're not coming back for you.
I don't think she thought she was going to be abandoned for 18 years.
18, that's a long, long time. It's kind of hard to comprehend what it would be like to be alone day after day, after month, year after year. I mean, at some point, it's got to really play on your psyche.
She could look to the east and think of hope and family. To the west, I wonder if there were times where she was desperate enough that she wished she could just get there, you know, to the quiche heaven and just be done? Or did she remain strong that whole time?
Fog crept in and out of the empty huts. It made shapes as it drifted, and they reminded me of all the people who were dead and those who were gone. The noise of the surf seemed to be their voices speaking.
In 1960, when the novel appeared, there weren't a lot of strong female characters in children's fiction.
What do you think was the most dangerous thing that Karana experienced while she was on the island?
One of the most dangerous things was the devilfish, the tsunami. I think the sea lion.
Rontu is Karana's beloved dog and companion, but before he became that, he of course was the leader of the pack of wild dogs who roamed the island, terrifying Karana and her younger brother, and in fact, who most likely mortally wounded and ate her younger brother. There's also a pretty harrowing event for Karana when she's in the Cave of the Ancestors.
Okay, what's the first thing you notice when you look into that cave? Nayan.
It's really dark and creepy.
Looks dark and creepy. Raise your hand if you would not want to be in that cave at night. Myself included.
You know, I really haven't put myself in her shoes, but I was moved by Cave of the Whales. It's kind of a spooky place. It's right at the edge of the ocean. You know, if I was the lone woman, I would have certainly known about this site. I would have felt the connection with the people who had painted those images, connection with the animal spirits that maybe they were depicting. That was a moving experience to be in the very back of that cave. It's a very sacred site.
After a while, everyone assumes, well, she must have died by now. Why they make that assumption, I don't know. Maybe it's just a way of justifying not going back and getting her.
In 1847, the Boston Atlas, I believe, was the first newspaper to report the story of the lone woman.
There was never any real confirmation until you have Captain Nidover spotting footprints on a beach.
They'd come out and they'd see a whispery figure in the fog.
They come back to the mainland. They tell the friars here at this mission that they found evidence of someone being on there. The friars encourage them to go back, and they do go back.
In 1853, George Nidover, who was a frontiersman and hunter who came to California, put together a crew and took Carl Dittman and 4 mission Indians to do 2 things, to look for the lone woman and also to sea otter hunt.
They were not on any sort of humanitarian expedition to find people and return them. They figured, well, if there's an Indian here, there's an Indian.
He lands at the island, and the first thing he does is he looks for her.
Carl walked along the shoreline and came around from behind. As he looked down through the brush, he thought he saw a crow here was this black object. As he came closer to that black object, it turned out to be the hair of the lone woman.
During the whole narrative, they're all very concerned that she's going to run.
He came very cautiously because he didn't know whether this would be the wild woman of San Nicolas Island or what it would be. So he came down from behind and presented himself, not knowing what to expect. Am I going to have a fight or what? But she smiled at him and went on her work. You'd think it was a daily occurrence that somebody would drop in.
According to Carl Dittman, the lone woman had matted hair, apparently sun-bleached, and she was wearing a nearly full-length garment made out of sewn squares of bird skin, cormorant skin.
Turns out they were never able to communicate with her.
The Mission Indians who are with Nidover can't communicate with her either.
They had to use sign language, and they got her to stay there, and they hunted for about a month or so.
I shook my head and smiled at him. He spoke again, slowly this time, and though his words sounded the same as before and meant nothing to me, they now seemed sweet. They were the sound of a human voice. There is no sound like this in all the world.
Well, when the lone woman left San Nicolas Island on George Nidover's schooner, they proceeded to go to Santa Barbara.
She comes in this whole new world, things she's never seen before. She's all excited.
I think the lone woman would have been fascinated, maybe overwhelmed.
One of the first things she sees is a man on a horse. She's making little hand signals as indicates a horse, a horse. They try to get everybody all excited about seeing this horse, and they're like, oh, it's a horse.
Might be like going to Disneyland for the first time.
On the island, the biggest animal on 4 legs she would have seen would have been her dogs.
She took up residence in the Nidover home, and of course that caused a real stir.
This becomes a really big, sensational news story. And this is another curiosity. Here's this woman, been alone for 18 years. So a lot of people come, and Nidover actually has even offered money for someone to take her and exhibit her as this, curiosity. And he refuses to do that.
The friars sent for mission Indians from various missions to come and talk and hopefully communicate, and unfortunately no one could communicate with her.
Maybe on the way here was excited at some point. I'm going to see my relatives again, going to see my family again. And then to get here and know that she was just as alone here as she was there, that must have been pretty miserable.
But she lived with the Nidovers only for about 6 weeks. She was unused to having nuts and fruit, and apparently the diet was too rich for her.
And she gets very, very sick. And what she contracts is dysentery.
She died at the Nidover home and given a burial here on mission grounds, according to the accounts near the bell tower, and that she was administered the sacraments before her death. And we have that record on the 19th of October in 1853 that they buried this Indian woman who had been transferred from San Nicolas Island.
It's kind of this wonderful, empowering story of survival, but it's also very tragic in the ending. Just really rips you up to think that after all those years on her own, she comes here into civilization and only lasts for a few weeks.
We do have the marker, and that is a wonderful experience for many people, not just the Californians who know the story, but people from the other parts of the United States and from all over the world who share in the wonderment of this story of this amazing woman and her life. It's just really awe-inspiring for everyone.
There was a man on the boat who heard this woman singing, and he taught this song to Fernando Librado Quetzalcoatl, who remembered this song.
She's a tremendous role model that is channeled through the character of Karana and Island of the Blue Dolphins, and I think that's why so many have fallen in love with the book.
I think what they take away from the book is how hard life can be. And I think what they see is that someone who's similar to their age survived in circumstances that they might not have seen themselves surviving in.
But I don't think I really understood at that age what that meant, what that story really represented, which is part of what we're doing now as a tribe and revitalizing our cultures. This book is about us. This is about your ancestors, your great-great-great-grandparents. They're often awed by that.
So now we remember her in this way when we sing this song, Toki Toki. Toki Toki,
For a long time, I stood and looked back at the island of the Blue Dolphins. The last thing I saw of it was the high headland. I thought of Rontu, lying there beneath the stones of many colors, and the little red fox that would scratch in vain at my fence, and of all the happy days.